Hello, everyone. Welcome. Going to let some of you get logged in here and we'll get started. Thank you so much for being here. All right, I'm going to just give it like one more minute here and then we'll get started. Let a few more people get logged in.
Okay. Oh, we see it. Here we go.
Hello from Indiana. Hello. I used to live in Indiana. I went to Butler. All right. All right, our number is leveling off a little bit here, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Arizona, Philadelphia, New Jersey. I love it. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'm Lara Hamilton. I have Book Larder here in Seattle. It's a cookbook shop in the Fremont neighborhood where we normally do a lot of in-person author talks. And so we're doing them on Zoom now, which it's not quite the same, but it has its benefits because we get to have people from all over the country join us for things like this. And we get to talk to authors like Shauna Sever, who are in Chicago while we're here and not able to travel and not necessarily able to get out there. Oh, and someone from Canada too. Thank you for being here. We are so excited to have Shauna here today. If you follow us at all on Instagram, you will know that I have posted about this book, Midwest Made, probably more than any other in the past couple of months. I've been baking from it constantly. I grew up in Illinois, and I think even if I hadn't, I would still think this was a pretty fantastic book. So we are going to leave time for your questions. If you could please use that Q&A feature that you see at the bottom of the screen for your questions rather than the chat feature, it will just make it a little easier for me to keep track of those while Shauna and I are talking. And I will try to get as many of them in as possible. If I can't, then I apologize in advance. And I also wanted to let you know that Shauna very graciously signed lovely book plates for copies of the book, and they are available on our website right now. We are offering free shipping right now. That's going to end really soon. So if you would like to get free US shipping on a copy of the book, you can order it from booklarder.com and support talks like this and support Shauna. And so I am going to welcome her to the chat and we will get going. Oh, Ozark skillet cake cooling right now. Delicious. And here she is. Hello.
Hi. How are you?
Doing well. How are you in all of this?
Very good. Very good. No, this is fantastic. This is like I was saying, like my first kind of re-entry into doing any sort of book thing. So
yeah,
this is wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. So
I'm so happy to be here with you. I only wish I could come to Book Larder in person, but
well, someday you will. Yeah.
Some other time.
And I appreciate that you were not put off by all of my Instagram. I kept joking about my Instagram stalking. I appreciate that you were not put off by that and actually agreed to talk with me today.
Not
I think
at
it was the 5 spice rolls where I was like, is this like the 4th thing I've posted from this book in about 2 months? I think this is getting a little out of hand. So thank you for
doing it. It means
that.
a lot. You see a lot of books, so it means a lot to have your stamp of approval. I appreciate that.
So this is sort of your sort of first re-entry. How has quarantine otherwise been for you and your family?
It's not been bad. I mean, I think I'm sort of an introvert at heart and ideally would never want to leave my house. So it's kind of, I mean, even though the world is burning, there are some benefits, I think, to being able to be inside. Of course, now that it's summertime, it's a little more difficult, especially with the kids. My daughter is 11, she's almost 12, and my son is 7. And so they're a little more restless. So we're doing what we can to kind of, go to the beach, get outside time, try and, make the most of this beautiful weather. But yeah, it's been good. It's just a lot of introspection, a lot of baking, and other people have been baking too. It's been great.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so what are you baking?
Oh, what am I baking? Well, I have my New Year's resolution, if we can even remember January at this point, feels like a lifetime ago. I actually made it sort of my New Year's resolution to finally get into sourdough because in the few years I was working on this book, it was like that was when everyone started doing it. It looked so cool and so fun, but I did not have the time to invest in it. So I started doing that January 1st, like created my starter before we knew any of this quarantine stuff was going to happen. So by the time everyone was really like the sourdough thing exploded in quarantine, I felt like for once in my life I'd been like ahead of the curve because I already had an active starter, So baking lots and lots of bread and experimenting with, stuff to do with the starter. Lots of simple cakes and cookies and, things that my kids can make. I mean, now they're old enough to kind of, I don't have to stand over them in the kitchen so much. So we like to keep it simple because I just kind of step out of the way and say, as long as you clean it up, go ahead. So yeah, it's always just the simple favorites that we go back to as a real comfort stuff we like.
Yeah. And so what are some of those comfort things that you like?
Well, of course, always it's the chocolate chip cookies and the brownies. I love a good pound cake. Actually been making a lot from the counter cakes chapter in the book. Those are cakes that are designed to be kept on the counter. They're perfect for quarantine when you're stuck in the house because the idea is, you're shaving off a slice every time you pass through the kitchen, and they're cakes that just get better and better, over time. So doing a lot of those. I love the chocolate chip marble bundt cake is a great one. The double chocolate zucchini loaf, now that we have zucchini coming in.
Oh, I know. I was just thinking I need to make that one, actually. That went on my list of to-dos. So yeah.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people making that recently because now all the zucchini is in, and what do we do with it? So. And
we're all sick of banana bread by now.
I know. Although I do make a lot of banana bread. I always, with the kids, it's like I'll buy a bunch of bananas thinking, oh, certainly this will be for snacking. And then they never get eaten. So we end up making the banana bread, but that never gets old. That's a good one.
Well, I'd love to chat a little bit about your career and then talk a little bit more about the book. So you studied journalism, I believe, if that's right, and spent some time in California, in LA, sort of doing entertainment reporting, and that sounds pretty glamorous. And so, I don't know. I think people would probably see those like red carpet jobs and be like, "Oh." What made you decide
at the time?
What's that?
It was exciting at the time. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what made you decide to sort of shift to food writing and that sort of thing full time instead of entertainment?
Yeah, well, actually, it was the red carpet sort of thing, the sort of celebrity news kind of grind that had me in my kitchen more baking as a way to sort of, reset and distract myself and kind of think through things. I think one of the best things about baking is it's such a meditative thing. And when you're able to sort of slow down and make something with your hands, it was just such a nice antidote to feeling like, the rat race of, trying to get jobs and running from event to event. And, there's a lot of adrenaline with stuff like that. It is a very exciting thing to be doing a press junket in a hotel room with, Keanu Reeves when I used to keep pictures of him in my locker in high school. These are very cool things. And you never, so that never stops really being exciting. Although sometimes you don't want to meet your heroes. Sometimes it can end up being kind of disappointing. But for me, I think starting to bake and then subsequently starting a blog, which was, old school blogging, 2006, 2007. But the reason I started that was just to have something to do that was other than this you know, Britney Spears chasing sort of grind that I was in, of these entertainment news jobs. And I found that I really loved writing in a different way. I mean, obviously with my journalism background, I was doing, right, you know, you have to know how to write a story, write an interview, especially on the fly. I mean, there's technical writing skill involved in that. But being able to write creatively about baking, and I think also, you know, I would just get homesick. I loved my time in LA. But I think, you know, I'm a very Midwestern person. And so that was a way for me to stay connected or get a sense of normalcy. And that was sort of the beginning of it, was starting that blog and thinking, okay, well, where else can I take this then, if this is something I'm becoming really passionate about? And it was easy to do at the time because there were so many great bloggers. There was like that first, well, maybe it was sort of the beginning of the second wave by that time of bloggers, people who were just really inspiring and really actually writing from the heart, and not, there was no SEO, nobody had ads at that time. It was kind of the Wild West in terms of food blogging. And so that was what was really inspiring to me. It was more of that food memoir style of writing. And so I was like, oh, you know, maybe this is something I could kind of start to explore. And then also while I was in LA, about the same time, I happened to get a part-time job writing recipes for a chef, a brilliant chef. His name was Joe Miller. He passed away last fall, unfortunately. But he had an amazing restaurant in Venice called Joe's that was Michelin starred. And I started working with him as a recipe writer, and I would sort of pay attention to what all of his cooks were doing and essentially try to create an internal cookbook of sorts he wanted for his staff. And so it was that job that forced me into getting more technical in terms of the art of recipe writing, which in itself is its own craft, you know? So I was like, oh, I can put these two parts together, you know, the food storytelling along with this technical writing and editing, which I really liked. And so that's kind of how the wheels started turning in terms of making the career pivot. Yeah. How I was going to do it had to kind of find me later, but that was about the era where I started making the switch, you know.
And then you had kids and, well, moved, I guess, to San Francisco and had kids. And then the food writing really sort of took off, it seems like.
Yeah. So it was August 2008. I had my daughter, and we had moved to San Francisco about a year before. And as soon as we moved to San Francisco, kind of found out the baby was coming. And so I couldn't really go anywhere. I didn't know anyone in San Francisco. There were no media jobs to be had. So I was almost sort of forced to sort of pivot in a way. And that was when I really started throwing myself into the blog in earnest and working on the writing and working on the recipes and getting better at baking and really becoming self-taught in terms of the chemistry of baking. Happened, you know, during the pregnancy. And then when she was born, and really like the first 2 years of her life, the blog was really like a lifeline for me. You know, I had really bad postpartum depression with my daughter, and it, you know, it saved me. It gave me something to do and engage my creativity. And because I was posting so regularly, I was able to sort of grow an audience from that, and met an editor through a friend of mine at a great, you know, small publisher, but they were doing really interesting books and kind of willing to take a chance on someone that was a first-time author. And so that's how that first book came about. And making that first cookbook, I was like, this is something I really love, the process of making a book. Everything from the, you know, the writing to the recipes to collaborating with the photographer and the designer and all of that. So once I found that process, I was like, okay, this is where it's all coming together now. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's interesting. I was reading sort of the intro to your book again today and realized how much we follow very similar paths, just sort of, I also studied journalism, moved west when I turned 25, you know, like all those sorts of things.
Gosh.
And so it was very interesting to read about how you, once you had kids, started to feel that sort of pull towards home again. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, it's twofold, right? So, you know, kids really make you think about where you're from and what of your own, you know, foundation you're going to sort of pass on to them. And so I think the recipes that I started to make once I had kids, you know, maybe when I first started out, it was a little more like I really wanted to learn about making fancy pastry. And, you know, I wanted to go to pastry school and really get into the fine art of classic pastry. And then I, you know, started to get really honest with myself, which you do when you're like very exhausted with children. And it's like, what are the things that really comfort me? What are the recipes that really speak to me? You know, what do I really enjoy making? And it's not to say that I didn't enjoy making things that had multiple elements, but I found that the simpler I was baking, kind of the happier I was. And also with kids, you have to simplify, you know. I remember making a recipe, maybe it was from the first tartine book or something like that. I think it took me like 3 days to make it because you had to make a curd and the icing and the cake layers. And when you've got, you know, a baby around, you can't do all that in one go. So I was like, oh, maybe this isn't quite, you know, my style. So I think in many aspects of my life, I've always been a late bloomer, but I think having my daughter being, you know, I think I was 30 by the time I went, oh, okay, this is really what I love. You know, this is really what's sort of speaking to me. And it's continued to evolve over time. I mean, my first cookbook was a little puffy. The book is literally puffy. It was about homemade marshmallows, you know, marshmallows.
Yeah,
Like
I remember it.
little, yeah, I mean, it's adorable. I mean, it's the little book that
It's very cute.
It's crazy. It just like keeps selling, which is so funny, but it's delightful. And it was a great way to kind of get my feet wet in the process and learn how to become a better recipe writer and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I'm hoping that, you know, what people have found with this last book is I feel like this was really my first real book, if you want to call it, my first real shot to like put all of myself and my life and my experience in between two covers, you know, and I'm super grateful for that opportunity. And it looks like that.
It does. Beautiful. Yeah. And I think it really, I mean, that really shows like you've put a lot of yourself into it clearly. And I wondered, when you set out to write it, like what were the recipes and the things that you thought like, okay, if I'm going to do this, like this has to be in here. Like these are the things that really sort of define what this means to me.
Yeah. Well, the short answer is I had an answer that came from the divine. It came from the other side. I knew going into this that it felt very high stakes to me because not only am I talking about my personal story and recipes that really speak to me, but I'm trying in some way to maybe kind of like represent my people.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot of pressure, right? And so what I always came back to was this idea of like, you know, of my own memories and my own story, and then hoping that can sort of translate. And what happened that was very interesting was my grandmother, who I was really super close to, I talk about her a lot in the book. And when I had first started my blog, I had, you know, talking to her on the phone, and I said, you know, Graham, I'm like, it'd be so great if you could make a list of recipes that you think are like quintessential Midwestern recipes. Like, what are the things we always made? What are the things that I should be writing about? So, of course. So she wrote like maybe 3 of them out some of them, there's actually a picture in the book of a bunch of recipes. And I think some of the cards are in that photo in the book, but she mailed me these index cards, you know, regular mail, like a grandma does. I think I had 3 or 4 recipes that I ended up, you know, posting on the blog. And this was, you know, 2008 maybe. And then, you know, like anything else, you know, she kind of forgot about it and I kind of forgot about it. And then I didn't really bug her about it again. And she passed in 2014. We ended up moving back to Chicago very unexpectedly in fall of 2015, so a year after she passed. And I knew I wanted to start working on this book or something to do with Midwest baking. And when she had passed away, the only thing I really wanted was her sort of old recipe, you know, accordion folder with all of her recipes in it. And I had looked through it a little bit, but it was hard, you know, to sit and really look through all of it emotionally. But when I started working on the book, I thought, all right, I gotta, you know, I poured a big cocktail and I'm like, I'm just gonna get into it
And
and
the
ugly
box of
cry.
tissues and
Exactly.
yeah.
And what I found when I started going through this was this slip of paper that had probably a dozen, no, it was 10. It was 10 recipes in her handwriting that she had written. So I knew right away when I looked at it, I was like, this is the list. This is the list. So she had sent the first 3 or 4 on the list and never, that had been, several years,
Yeah.
but I knew right away when I saw it. I was like, there it is. And it became the 10 commandments. It was funny because it was 10 and she was a very religious person. So here it is, the 10 commandments of Midwest Made, and her 10, takes on what she thought were things that belonged in the book. And almost all of them were. And I tacked it up by my desk, and that became kind of my, the North Star, if you will, of trying to go back to figuring out what types of things we wanted in this book and what do we want it to feel like, and those recipes also helped me to come up with the 5 tenets of Midwestern baking, which is on the back of the book. And I was like, what do all these things have in common? I mean, she set me up, like she fully set me up, and I got it at a time when I needed to get it, like when I was looking for that inspiration, and she was like, here you go. I mean, it's just so my grandma, it's hilarious.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what sort of kicked off the initial sort of thinking about the spirit of the things that were going to be in the book.
Yeah. Well, and I think sort of how you define Midwest baking is interesting, because when I think about, like I've lived out here for a long time now, and every now and then I'll make something or I'll be served something at an event and I'll think like, ooh, that person must be from the Midwest somewhere. You know what I mean? But I can't quite put my finger on like what it is about it that made me think that. Do you know what I mean? Besides, I mean, there are obviously like dishes we could joke about, but so tell us, sort of what makes Midwest baking to you?
Yeah.
How do you
So
define
that was challenging, trying to think about how do you try and distill it into something that I knew I would need these touchstones, these tenets, these things I could come back to, and trying to take thousands of recipes. I mean, a lot of the stuff in the book is original, a lot, and then there's a chunk that are things that were taken from vintage books or community cookbooks that really spoke to me as being quintessentially Midwestern. So like what passed the test, you know what I mean? And so that's the bake big, bake easy, bake with purpose, bake in the past, and bake in the present. And those are things that I think all sort of things that feel Midwestern to me have in common. There are things that ideally you want to be able to serve to a crowd that are going to please a lot of different palates. And, so sometimes that means, I don't have any Cool Whip in the book, but, if you've got yourself a good,
I ate a lot of Cool Whip in my childhood, that's for sure.
Fabulous, fantastic. There is a time and a place for it. I ate a lot of it when I was pregnant. You just can't get away from that, whatever that taste is.
Something about it, yeah.
Something about it. And it's, it's a feeling of abundance and things that will make people slow down and spend a little more time at a meal or something like that. And I do a lot of, I actually ended up writing like an essay about dessert salads in the book, because it's like, what is it about this thing that is so quintessentially Midwestern? And it's funny because dessert salads are not dessert, and they're usually on the buffet with the savory things. But then if you think about it, if you've got a little bit of that on your plate, it will make you sit at the table a little bit longer before we transition to the dessert part, So I think there's a lot of things that are about extending that experience, It's like pie being the quintessential Midwestern baked good. It's like you need to sit down with a fork and a plate. It's meant to be shared. It's practical because why would you make dozens of cupcakes when you can just make one pie and serve everybody? I mean, there's so many Midwestern sort of values packed into the concept of a pie, it's that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. It's like, it when you taste it. And that was what was hard of it, trying to define that and trying to articulate that,
Yeah.
But when you say that,
Oh, sorry.
People know exactly what you mean. It's like,
Yeah, totally, totally. And I think your point about feeding a crowd, I think is really important, because I can't think of, like if my mom was just baking for us, she made cookies. But if we were seeing any family or going anywhere, I mean, I feel like my eating until I was about 18 was like largely defined by big family buffets and potlucks. Like it was just, they were always gatherings. And I don't know if that's just a factor of living near your family, or if that's just something that culturally, people in the Midwest just do more often. I'm not sure, but I just thought you captured that element so beautifully as well.
thank you. No,
Yeah.
that was definitely how I grew up until the point that I was probably in college. I always had extended family around, and that was always the safe place and the happy place was my grandparents' house. And I had, my mom had me when she was young, and she was the oldest sibling. And so I had all of these
Me too.
aunts that were pretty young. I mean, a couple of them
Yeah.
were still in high school when I was born. So these became, babysitters, and I, tag along with them to everything, and they let me, bless them. But, they were always in and out of the house. And my grandfather was a great cook and had a little garden, and, we always were around the table. So yeah, I think it's a very Midwestern thing. And I think that's changed a lot, in the past, generation. People move away a little bit more, but
Yeah.
certainly when I was a kid, it was the case that a lot of people were local.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, as you were talking about your grandmother's recipes, is again, like I also, have several of my grandmother's recipes. And the thing that I have found very interesting, is I will go look at like something I remembered from when I was a kid. Like my mom recently sent me a recipe for this strawberry cake that we used to eat all the time. And I've gotten kind of used to this by now, where like, I don't want to say it's disappointment, but it's almost like this, like you get the recipe and you're like, oh yeah, this was a box of cake mix, a box of pudding or Jell-O,
I was waiting for that. Yeah.
a stick of Oleo, like these were,
Delicious.
like these were the things. And it's not, and it was delicious and wonderful. And I know that lots of people still bake that way, and I do not begrudge them. I think it's more that like when you are thinking about your grandmother, you're like, oh, but she made everything by hand. And it's like, and you forget that, they were cooking. I mean, they were, feeding families in the 50s and 60s when they were just relieved to not have to cook everything from hand anymore. Anyway, I
Exactly.
noticed that you obviously took some of those recipes and sort of made them into a homemade sort of dish. And I just wondered how you, well, first of all, how you converted things, but also how you sort of gave yourself permission almost to reimagine some of them. Like I'm thinking, like I'm looking right here at the cover of the book, I mean, you cannot have lived anywhere in the Midwest in the 80s or 90s and not had the peanut butter Hershey Kiss cookies, right? But you sort of
Yeah.
reimagine them as a more delicious, I would say, and sort of more homemade thing. So anyway, I just wanted to ask you about this. How did you approach that challenge, and what did you give yourself permission to sort of be like, oh yeah, I'm going to remake that? And were there things where you went like, nope, I'm just leaving that where it is and I'm not going to try to redo it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because there are things where you're just like, oh, I'm going to make somebody mad, which is a very, you want to be polite. You're Midwestern. You don't want to pick anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
There were a couple things that I decided early on. A good example of that would actually be the raspberry poke cake, which, would typically, I grew up with cakes like this that would have been, box cake mix, the Jell-O, out of the box, and then Cool Whip on top.
Yep.
Super delicious. You
Great.
can find 1 million of them on Pinterest.
Yeah.
It's not important for me to put another one of those out just for the sake of kind of completing this puzzle. So
Right.
I kind of felt like something that was great was having the opportunity to modernize some of these really kitschy recipes, and find a way for the people who wanted to, who may, avoid a poke cake because they think, oh, I've got to get Jell-O and Cool Whip, to show them a new way of doing it. And so they can, maybe make it for their own kids in a way that, maybe some of us don't want to feed our families those things all the time. You know, how can you have more of this kind of memory in your own family in like a fresher, more modern way? And so that's how I kind of gave myself permission to do things like that, was thinking, what do bakers want now? Like, what do bakers like me want now? You know, and how can you bake more often is the question. And you can do that by using less processed ingredients and things that are fresher and more seasonal, but still kind of getting the same effect. The other thing, you know, and that's kind of the case with the peanut butter blossoms that you mentioned on the cover.
Yeah.
Was like, what was always problematic about that cookie for me was like, you bite into it and the whole Hershey's Kiss comes off in the first bite, and then it kind of cancels out the whole experience.
And then you're like, oh, and now, yeah, exactly.
Right. So that's kind of how that one came up. And also, you know, I really have grown to love the flavor of, you know, darker chocolate and stuff like that. So I wanted kind of like a bittersweet chocolate for that cookie. And then when you look at some of the items like let's see. Oh, the other cookies that are on the cover, the Kolachki that's on the cover.
Oh, yeah.
Typically, we might make those with the cream cheese dough, and we would use the canned filling for that, which is how that company, you know, came to become a huge company, was based off that cookie. Well, I mean, it's an Eastern European sort of cookie. And so then when you go back in and try and figure out, okay, how would this have really been made from scratch? You know, a lot of times the answers for me were going back several decades, going back to find the roots of a recipe pre-1950s. Usually gave me the answer in terms of what were the roots. So in that case, you know, you go back to the country that it's from, and then you can find your filling with that, and then so I turned the apricot filling into an apricot and orange blossom filling. And so that's nice, but you make it with dried apricots, and it's like a very quick, almost like making like a stovetop jam out of dried fruit. And it's delicious. And, you know, so you're kind of bringing it back to the roots too. That's usually like a good sort of reasoning when you're messing with something kitschy, is trying to kind of unravel it a little bit, find out where it first came from. Like I did with the dessert salad essay, and kind of thinking, oh, this could have been based on some of these Scandinavian fruit desserts that are very gelatinous, because they're based on like fermented yogurt things and stuff. And that's been eaten as dessert in those countries for, you know, 1,000 years. And then they come to the United States, and they're part of their, you know, their church crowd, and they need to serve a crowd. So they're taking textures and flavors they know and using these convenience products to sort of create that, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
So it becomes Jell-O, Cool Whip, marshmallows, maybe some pecans. And
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes they get really weird. But
oh, totally.
You know,
Yeah. No, we used to carry a book at the shop, actually, that was it was like a little tiny photo book that someone went back and like recreated a bunch of those Jell-O molds and Jell-O salad-y kinds of things from the 70s, and just took pictures of them. And it's, you know, you could do a whole book of those. They're going to have a moment again, I think.
Oh yeah, and people love I did the red berries and cream Jell-O, because you have to have some sort of red gelatin with cream aspect if you're going to do a Midwestern. But I did that, you know, with fruit juice, real fruit juice, and did like a panna cotta layer with buttermilk instead of the Cool Whip in the middle of the red Jell-O mold. And, you know, it's great. You get a little nod to it with fresh ingredients, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so were there any things that you really wanted to include, but just decided, I'm just going to sort of leave that aside?
Yeah, you know, there were, once you get into that dessert salad realm, you're like, ooh, you can go deep, you know? There was this thing I came across that I still really love that was called Plum Fluff. I just like the idea of a plum fluff. It's fun to say, it tasted good. It was, you know, but then I came across the angel fluff recipe, which ended up in the book. And that was so crazy and so delicious and just kind of off the wall, but still had all real ingredients in it, except for the marshmallows. You use marshmallows out of the bag for that. But, you know, it uses real whipped cream, and you sort of bake this it's one that's not photographed in the book. So this is one I like to talk up, because a lot of times people skip recipes that don't have photos. But you basically take a batter and you spread it out really thin to make almost like a crispy sort of cookie, and you crumble that up with whipped cream and marshmallows, which I highly recommend getting the large marshmallows and cutting it with scissors so you have the surface area that doesn't have the starch on it, because it helps it to sort of dissolve and set the fluff. And it's like creamy angel food cake, marshmallowy vanilla goodness. It's delicious. It's the wackiest thing. And so, you can't have too many fluffs in a book. One is enough in one chapter. So those were those things where I kind of had to, kind of check those off, or recipes that I was kind of trying to get it just right and it wasn't working, and then it sort of went past my threshold. Usually if I'm testing for a book and I'm on a pretty tight schedule and I'm, get like 4 failed attempts, I usually sort of shelve it. I'm like, if this isn't something that I can decipher, it will become sort of too difficult and cumbersome for a reader, and that's not fair. So, those are the things you sort of shelve.
Okay. We have a question from Brenda that I think sort of ties to what we've been talking about. So she says, my mom has always made cherry pie bars with the canned cherry pie filling spread out over the whole surface. In your mom's cherry shortcake squares, whose brilliant idea was it to put the 3 cherries in a grid per piece?
I don't know. I mean, that was how we always had it. And I was trying to remember or talk to my mom about where it came from. And she was like, I don't know. That recipe has been, I was a toddler eating those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love that recipe.
Yeah. And then Amber agrees that the poke cake is the perfect example of baking from the past, bringing it to the present. She would also like to know if you think Midwestern equals kitsch.
That's a good question. There's an aspect to it that I think people embrace. And the thing that I really grew to respect about kitsch was the fact that these recipes that run on the packaged ingredients or the cream of mushroom soup or whatever it is.
Right.
A lot of that comes from the fact that the most iconic food companies are based in the Midwest, and they always have been. And they hired women who were Midwestern women. Many of them were in a very small population of women who actually became educated, went to universities, and they were they all majored in home economics because that's what you were allowed to major in back in the day. And rather than just going back home with their degrees and becoming professional housewives, they got into the workforce and they went and they worked for these companies that were based in the Midwest. And their job was to develop recipes using these convenience, products. And they created some of the most iconic American recipes. And when you look at it that way, it doesn't seem quite so, cheap or kitschy or whatever. It's like, wow, these were some real enterprising women who came up with it. And so when I think about, the green bean casserole, I have like a whole lot more respect for that, And so that really changed my mind, thinking about the roots of some of the kitschier things. And the same thing goes for the immigrant influences of the region, which is a huge part of the book for me. Once I realized that I could connect the dots and figure out where these things came from, it's become such a rich story that, kitsch or not, you have to appreciate the fact that so many recipes in the Midwest, they have that purpose, which is why one of those things that became one of the tenants, There's always a backstory with food here, which I think became such a beautiful surprise because people underestimate the Midwest in that way, thinking it's like flyover country, there's not a lot of culture, when the truth is it's all so deeply embedded that we take it for granted.
Yeah.
So,
for sure. Yeah, it's funny. Another thing that I think we had in common was not really appreciating the place until we moved away from it. that sense of like, oh gosh, I always was like, I seriously can't remember a time in my childhood when I wasn't like, I'm just not ever going to live here for, like I'm leaving, like that's it. And now, I have a much deeper appreciation for the place. And I always find it funny, like people here will always be like, can't believe I'm Midwestern or I'm from a small town or whatever. And I'm just like, well, what do you think that means? You know, like
Yeah.
I'm gonna like not speak in complete sentences. And I mean, it's, you know, it's like almost offensive now. So anyway,
Well,
whereas years ago I would have been like, yeah, thank you. And now I'm like, forget it.
Now,
What?
where in Illinois are you from?
Oh, I'm downstate. So I'm from a town called Carlinville, and it's in between basically Springfield and St. Louis off of 55.
So Southern Illinois, I mean, which is very different. And I say this in the book, like I am a
Oh yeah.
Great Lakes snob. I was raised in the suburbs all around the city, and you know, it changes. It very much changes. You know, where you're located in the Midwest changes what you think Midwest food is. And like I was very careful to say that in the introduction. And it is an enormous region with an enormous amount of influences. You know, and so this is
Yeah.
my perspective. You know,
Yeah.
I've gotten some flack in that. This is a Chicago book. This isn't a Midwestern book. And I'm like, well, Dan,
It's gonna be whatever. Yeah,
Well,
it's
I
gonna
don't
be
know
whatever
what
book
but
you
right.
I mean it's your book, right? So yeah, anyway.
But that's something that I think is so telling about the region, that where you're from becomes your hub. That's your
Yeah.
point of view, you know.
Yeah, and it is viewed as this sort of homogenous blob. And
it
it
is
is not. It
absolutely could not
absolutely.
be further from the truth. Yeah.
Along those lines, Karen has two questions. She says that her family heritage is in Indiana. And is there a recipe that you think of that you most closely associate with that state? And
Yes,
then
yes.
she would also like to know, as you did your research, what was a recipe you saw that sounded awful but was actually delicious?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, the major Indiana recipe in the book is going to be the brown butter speckled sugar cream pie. Sometimes that's, you know, that's it's kind of like the desperation pies they're called, where it's actually thickened with flour. It's, you know, usually just flour and milk, and there's no eggs, and it's, you know, and you bake it in the crust and it's set as it cools. And in mine, I opted to incorporate some brown sugar and a little brown butter, and just to sort of boost the flavor in it. But Hoosier sugar cream pie is a quintessential Indiana recipe. But there are ways to sort of, you know, boost the flavor, and so that's what I opted to do with that one. And then what was the other part of that question?
It was there a recipe that you thought was going to, that you saw that sounded awful, but was delicious?
What was delicious? Well, I have to tell you, the angel fluff just like blew my mind. Like I was like, I almost tried that just as this is crazy. Like I can't even envision what this is going to be or be like. And that was something that was just like, it's got to go in. It's got to go in. We made it like 3 times in a week, and it was so simple and so surprising, and such a great example of a make-ahead recipe where the magic really happens as you let it chill in the fridge. It's almost like it's kind of like a mushed up icebox cake is really what it is. But when I found out about it, it was this old, you know, state fair recipe that didn't really have much, you know, context. There was no picture. There was no explanation of what you were going to get in the end. And so I kind of just waded into it.
Yeah.
But that was one that was like truly greater than the sum of parts.
All right. And let's see. Heather has a question. It is so hot right now. We like to make doorstep treats for friends, but we are afraid stuff will melt. Do some things hold up better than others in the heat? My first thought is just, okay, what's not chocolate? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, that's so sweet. I love how open people have become about sharing their baking. That's been one of the great gifts of quarantine, I feel like. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the caramel canvas blondies, which again, do not have a photo in the book, but to me, they are so good. So rich in flavor. And you can put whatever you want in that. I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to do chocolate, but you could do nuts in that. But those are very good, and they just kind of get a little bit better over time. And even if it was a warm day, they're not going to fall all over on you. And everyone loves a bar cookie. And you can cut them, you know, bigger, smaller, however you want to do it. So that's one of the first thing that comes to mind. Also the Mrs. Braun's, or Mrs. Brown, excuse me, I always do that. Spelled like Braun, pronounced Brown. Sorry, Grandma. Those oatmeal cookies are delicious. Those are just golden raisin oatmeal cookies. No chocolate in those. The Giant Awesome peanut butter cookies are giant and awesome.
I will vouch for those. I have made those so many times.
So good. And you know, that's been a funny recipe because I've had so many people, you know, write and say that they love them. And then every once in a while, I'll get someone where it's like an absolute fail, or they spread, or and I can never figure it out because I'm like, it's so straightforward. I can never figure where people are.
So I will tell you what they're doing.
What? Tell me.
Doing what I did, probably. I'll bet you this is what they're doing.
Tell me.
So this is what I did the first time. I got the small jar of Jif or Skippy. I don't even remember which one I bought. Yeah. And it was not quite enough for the recipe. And I topped it up with natural peanut butter. And even using any natural peanut butter at all, when you don't have that stabilizer, right? That's why they spread. I will bet you that the people that say it's spreading are either using like super high fat butter, or they are using natural peanut butter. Even just a little bit of natural peanut butter will.
I don't know, maybe people are lying. I don't know, because that's always the first thing I ask is like, what peanut butter are you using? And yeah, Skippy is a great brand for baking in the way that a lot of authors, including myself, will always recommend Philly cream cheese.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's just the stabilizer, like there's something in it.
Less water. It's
less water that gives it a little more texture, and you get a more direct, like you get that peanut butter flavor you expect, right? It's that like real creamy, rich kind of taste. Yeah.
So that would be a good recipe too for doorstep treats. I'm also a big fan of leaving like whole loaf cakes, or if you took one of the loaf cake recipes, like the banana bread, for example, and you got those smaller loaves and just kind of did them in mini loaves, that's always really fun too.
Did you already say the pound cake?
Oh, no, the pound cake would be a great idea for that. Amazing. Isn't it so good?
So good.
Great Aunt Phyllis.
Froze one, did the loaf pans, like you said, and I froze one. And then when we got strawberries, like 2 weeks ago, I got it out of the freezer, and we had strawberries and whipped cream. It was so good.
I think cakes like that are even better when you freeze them and thaw them. Something happens with the moisture; they get extra delicious. So I'm sure that was what a nice. Don't you feel so like accomplished when you freeze something like that?
Yes.
I just am like, thank you, past self. That's always such a great feeling.
And sometimes when I'm doing it, I'm like, I am going to be so glad I have this at some point. It's going to just like make my day. So yeah, totally.
Good for you. Good for you.
Totally. We also had a question about why you use European butter in some recipes.
Yeah. So most of the time I'll indicate this. And I'm sure this is something I put in the introduction. I know I did. Where there are just some recipes where the butter actually will sing a little bit more if you use the European style butter. It has just a little bit more butter fat in it, where you really do taste the difference. Now, I'm not going to be someone who tells you to put it in every recipe. If it doesn't make a difference, just use the supermarket butter that you like. But sometimes it really does, if it can kind of lift something a little bit more, I'll always recommend it. But no, you can always, they're interchangeable. It'll just give you that little something that when people eat it, they're like, oh, why is your frosting so much better than my frosting when you use the same recipe? It's like, because it's like that one little bit of punctuation on a recipe,
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Laura would like to know, she says is it potica? Potica?
Oh, potitza.
Potica in our family. So I was very excited to see your recipe. We shape our potica very differently. We do just one roll. What is the history behind your shape, and do you see a variety of potica shapes?
Yes. So this is one of those dishes that was so interesting to research because there are so many different pronunciations. People know it by many different things. And so the one that I opted to use in the book, I chose it simply for baking vanity because it is beautiful. It's this one. If you want to know what we're talking about.
It is
And
quite a start, I will say. It is a, like as far as like your opening salvo recipe, I'm like, oh yeah, that's it's beautiful.
Because I had done a few books prior, and I always style my own food for the photographs. It's a really important part of my process in choosing how something is going to look, because I know I'm going to have to, photograph it. And so when I was working on this recipe, I did do one, we'll get a little blue with the story. It's fine. It's almost 8 o'clock in the Midwest. When I did it, I actually did the one, and maybe this is what she's talking about, where you can actually take, because essentially what you're doing is you're taking the dough, you're rolling it really super like paper thin, putting the filling and then rolling it. So that's how you get those whispers thin sort of layers. And some people will just do it in one spiral, like in a cake pan. And I did that one. And then the center of it, like if you could imagine it being sort of in a coil, the center of it always kind of wanted to like pop up a little bit in the middle. And then it ended up always looking a little kind of like tapered and sort of I see the photos on Instagram, not even realizing what it looks like. And maybe somebody's watching this right now and you remember the infamous Instagram post. Because I was like, ooh, late night baking. And then got all these DMs that are like, do you realize what that looks like? And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. So then short time later, I sort of discovered a loaf version. And I went, oh, that is much safer.
Yeah.
And also had that beautiful cross section. So that was a funny story. But the reason is, you can find it in many different sort of forms, depending on regions. I mean, it's Croatian. I say it here in the head note, Croatian, Slovenian.
Right.
It's a number of different Eastern European countries that essentially make the same thing, but some just do it in one long roll and they bake it on a big long sheet and then you just slice it like that. So there's a number of different ways to have it.
Yeah.
The spiral one's tricky. That's the answer. The coil.
So Isabel says that she has a bowl of the monster cookie dough in the fridge and will bake some of them tomorrow. Does this dough freeze well, portioned out, or should I bake them and then freeze them for later use?
I am a huge fan of freezing, like balling up the cookie dough, and I put it all on a sheet tray lined with parchment paper. Just put that whole sheet tray in the freezer if you can, if your freezer is big enough. Just freeze it solid and then throw all the dough balls into a Ziploc. And then you just need to add like an extra minute or two sometimes to the baking time. But I think it just does wonders for the texture of a cookie. And so I would just recommend freezing the dough, and then you get that wonderful domestic sort of feeling when you get to bake, fresh cookies whenever you want them. So I would recommend freezing it in the ball form. I'm so excited for you to try them. I love, love, love that cookie. So good.
Oh, they look amazing. So Kirsty has a shout out she lives in Arizona now. She used to be in Geneva, Warrenville in Illinois. She would also like to ask what she should make first from the book.
Oh, well, wow. That is always like choosing children. I guess, it just depends. It depends on the day. The thing I really tried to do with this book was to choose, recipes that could be sort of evergreen, Let's see here. Well, I hate to be so boring, but the banana bread is really good. And I love it. It is good. Yeah. And I think it's a good way to sort of work your way into a book because it's a pretty foolproof sort of recipe. I really love the glazed apple slices. I've seen a lot of people making these recently, and there is a photo in the book, which is good. So maybe that's part of it. People are getting attracted to it. Kind of like a giant Pop-Tart or a giant slab pie. The difference being that there is a layer of crushed cornflakes it's more of a Danish style pastry in that I believe there's an egg in it. Yes, there's an egg yolk and a little bit of milk. So it's a very sort of tender, really fun pastry to work with because it's just really pliable, much more so than regular pie crust. And then the cornflakes kind of go underneath the apples and they totally disappear. It's like a magic trick. They totally disappear and get absorbed in the juices. And then you ice the whole thing with a really thin confectioner sugar icing. And that's just a really nice, it's like homey, it tastes like apple pie, but it's like rustic. And I mean, that might be a good place to start for a pie if you don't want to get into major pie times with a pie plate. That's one that people are loving lately. I don't know. That's a hard question. That's a hard question.
And Amanda would like to know, what is your favorite cookbook? She says she has been baking through your book this year, but she's looking for something to do for next year.
Oh, that's also a very good question. I am a really huge fan of British cookbooks, actually. I love Nigella. I love Diana Henry. Of course, I love Dory. Who doesn't love Dory? It's a good question. You know, yeah, that's kind of what I would say. I always end up kind of going back to books. You know, I love the Violet Bakery cookbook.
Yeah.
I always love disappearing into that book. Mm-hmm. There's a book by Justin Delattley, I think his name is. The bread, cake, donut, pudding.
Yeah, that book is wonderful too.
So British.
Yeah. There will be a new Violet Bakery book next year, actually.
I just heard I think it was just yesterday I learned about that. I cannot wait. It's so beautiful. I also am a really big fan of Nita Heater. I always turn to her recipes. I'm like a really big super fan. It's a huge inspiration for me. And so a lot of times I'll turn to her books. I have a number of them that I've collected over the years. Any one of her books is always going to be great.
That Happiness is Baking. You know, she had the 3 new sort of books that came out. That Happiness is Baking book would be a really fun one to go through as well. I think Dory did the intro for that one, actually.
She did.
Yeah.
And then when that book came out, I got to do like a really spastic interview on the Splendid Table about how much I love Nita Heater.
Oh, yeah.
It allowed me to share all of my trivia that I've stored up about her because I love her life and her story and the way she pivoted too. She pivoted a number of times in her career and her life and then came to becoming this legendary baker and writer, you know, in her 50s. I mean, it's just like such a great story. And she's just so herself, and her style is so fabulous. I love her. Rest in peace. But
worked until she was, what, 102, I think, when she.
Oh my goodness! Right? I mean, forever. Yeah. Amazing.
So one last question. Maureen would like to know if you're working on a new book, and I guess that ties to the sort of what's next for you question.
What a nightmare.
Just enjoying your current book and your life is a perfectly fine answer for what's
No, you know, I would love to talk about this. And I would love to talk about it because I think it's a really important conversation, especially for women to be having right now. Women who have children and you're trying to balance the uncertainty of where will they go in the fall? We don't know. They could be right in here with me, and they probably will be. You know, it's funny because I went into quarantine thinking, oh, I can work on a new book because I kind of thought, you know, something I would really like to do would be more of a book that would incorporate more savory. So it would still have plenty of sweets and baking, but then also some, you know, great Midwestern, you know, dishes that you can, you know, because I do eat things that aren't cake. And there's a lot of great stories there too. So that was kind of what I thought I would start working on as I went into quarantine. I'm not sure. I'm working on some freelance projects right now. I'm working on putting together a cookbook for something that's more of like a nonprofit type situation with it's like I can't say too much about it right now, but there's some really cool musicians attached actually that yeah, that are coming together to kind of create this cookbook that they can use to raise the money for, social justice causes and food issues and things like that. So that's something I'm kind of lending more of my technical expertise to. But the thing I really love is this idea of just expanding, all of us expanding beyond what we thought we could do or what we thought our interests were. It's been such an interesting time to think about the next steps and how we can all sort of, be better and do more. And so, yeah, it's been different. I wish I had like this answer where it's going to be, Midwest made, yada, blah, 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 the sequel. But no, we'll see, get into it. But I will say that the thing I'm really super proud of with this book is that it's a book that, I bake from my own book, like most of the time. Like this is the stuff that I truly love, that I feel is what my family loves. And it's such a rewarding thing to finally feel like, other people are loving it too, which is amazing to me. Because if I never have the opportunity to do another book again, I don't think I will. But if I never did, it's like, this feels so good to feel like it's all, truly a representation of like where I'm from and who I am,
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think you did all of us proud, all of us, all of us Midwestern.
So
Thank
good.
you for representing us well.
Thank you.
Did we, was there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't talk about?
I don't think so. No, we covered quite a lot.
We went all over the place. Yeah. And I'm sorry that I didn't get to everyone's questions. We are at 6:02 now, and I just want to respect everyone's time. So thank you so much, Shauna, for your time. And thank you everyone for joining us. And going on this hour-long journey through Midwest treats with us. Again, Shauna signed book plates, so you can get signed copies on the Book Larder website, and we are doing free US shipping right now. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Shauna. Have a lovely
evening. Thank you so much.
Congratulations again on your book, and thank you so much for writing it. It's really great.
Thank you.
My dad gives it, the big seal of approval, everything I've made from it for him so far. And so, I feel, as far as I'm concerned, that's like,
if it's a Midwestern dad,
possible.
Done. Done.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you. You too. Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you.